So today we're looking at the Lam Rim structure, the stages of the path to enlightenment. And we saw there that the first topic was relying on a teacher, the advantages of having a personal teacher. The second reflection was to reflect on our precious human life, to understand the precious opportunity we have and how we would like to then take advantage of that and make our life meaningful. And then how to make our life meaningful, we're looking here in the Lam Rim in terms of the 3 levels of capacity. That at the initial level we can have a motivation simply striving for a good future, and then on top of that we can build to have a motivation not only to strive for a good future but to strive to break free of this whole cycle of existence called samsara, to strive for the goal of nirvana. So that was someone of middling capacity. And now we're currently looking in the 3rd level of making our life meaningful, someone of great capacity, meaning not only to have the motivation to wish to liberate ourselves from suffering, but to expand on that motivation to wish also to help to liberate everyone else from suffering. So that's someone of great capacity. They have as their goal enlightenment. And so far what we've seen is the first 2 topics here were the 7 cause and effect and the equalizing and exchanging self with others. So these 2 practices are practices that can help us to cultivate this aspiration of bodhicitta. So if we cultivate the aspiration of bodhicitta, then we have the aspiration for enlightenment. So this is the entry point into the Mahayana path. Once we've cultivated this aspiration, of course, we need a method or a path to actually achieve enlightenment. And so here in the Lam Rim handout that you have, you see that the next topic mentioned is the 6 perfections. And those 6 perfections, of course, were listed on the 3 vehicles chart that you've also got. And these are the practices that we are to engage in to strive for the goal of enlightenment. And the 6 perfections, of course, very briefly were generosity, ethics, patience, joyous effort, concentration, wisdom. And we saw there yesterday that the first 3, that is generosity, ethics and patience, can be subsumed as ethics. And then we have concentration and wisdom, and then the 4th perfection, joyous effort, is something we need to apply to all 3 of those. So also the 6 perfections here can be condensed into the same 3 core areas of practice, as we saw here in the person of middling scope. Someone who's striving for the goal of nirvana engages in the 3 higher trainings: ethics, concentration, wisdom. So remember here, ethics was simply to avoid harmful, non-virtuous behavior. In the 6 perfections here, the ethics is not only avoiding harmful, non-virtuous behavior, but it's more proactive, because here in this great scope, great capacity, we are also working to help liberate others. So ethics is not just about avoiding harmful behavior, but it's also the ethics of benefiting others and the ethics of engaging in virtue as well. And then on that basis, we enter into the concentration practice. So here, concentration practice, develop single-pointed concentration. Similarly here. So the concentration practice that we're talking about, of course, is shamatha. And then on the basis of developing this calm, clear, focused mind, then here, of course, the wisdom practice or vipassana practice, the insight we are to develop here is the insight into no self, that there's no autonomous me, no autonomous self. And if we can realize there's no autonomous self, we can achieve the goal of nirvana. Here in the Six Perfections, when we talk about wisdom practice or vipassana practice, then we're primarily talking about this wisdom of emptiness that we saw in those three vehicles chart yesterday. So here in the Six Perfections, the two core practices on the basis of ethics is shamatha and vipassana. So what I'd like to do, starting this evening and continuing tomorrow morning, is look at these two practices in some detail. We already looked a little bit at the shamatha practice on the first evening of this retreat, so I'd like to review that and add some more things here, and then we'll look at this vipassana practice in quite some detail tomorrow morning. So again here, the vipassana practice is primarily the insight into emptiness, that nothing exists independently. But what I'd like to do tomorrow morning is also look at the vipassana practice here, this wisdom of no self, and see what the difference is there and how to go about developing that wisdom as well as the wisdom of emptiness. So that's a little bit for tomorrow morning. We're going to start to look at the shamatha practice this evening. But before we launch into that, I'd just like to complete the Lam Rim structure. So with these Six Perfections practices, of course, with the motivation of bodhicitta, these Six Perfections practices will enable us to achieve the goal of enlightenment. And then we have one more thing mentioned there in the Lam Rim, which is the two stages. Which is the Tantra level of practice. So remember, in the Tantra or Vajrayana, we are gaining access to the deepest level of our mind, this very subtle mind, and using that in our vipassana practice. Now, in the Lam Rim, when you go through the Lam Rim text, this here, you'll get probably one paragraph right at the end of the whole text. And it'll say, if you have the basis for entering into Tantra practice, i.e. you have renunciation, bodhicitta, and the wisdom of emptiness, then find yourself a qualified teacher and they will give you instruction. So you won't find in the Lam Rim text any detailed presentation of this, because this is an instruction that you would get directly from your personal teacher. Because at the level of tantric practice, because of the profundity and subtlety of the practice, we really need to have that direct link to a personal qualified teacher and to be guided very closely. So in general, historically at least, you would never find any texts about Tantra, or there would never be any public teachings about Tantra. You would only ever hear about this personally from your qualified teacher if they felt you were ready to begin that practice. So therefore in the Lam Rim text, again, you maybe get one paragraph right at the end saying, if you have the prerequisites and you find a qualified teacher, they will introduce you into these practices. So this is the Lam Rim structure. Any questions about any of this before we start to look at these two practices in more detail?
Patient. What was patient?
Sorry?
It was one of the stages, one of the, I don't remember what was the patient.
Patience, yeah. So that's one of the Six Perfections.
What's the meaning?
Yeah. So patience is defined simply as an undisturbed mind in the face of a difficult situation. Because often in Buddhism, you'll hear that the antidote to anger is patience. Often that's presented like that. And then people misunderstand that. And they think, oh, instead of getting angry, I just got to sit there and do nothing. This is not patience. Patience is not a behavior. Patience is a mental attitude. So what is Buddhism is suggesting, patience as the antidote to anger, Buddhism suggesting that if you're faced with a difficult situation and you get angry, you're out of control. So rather than do that, be patient, which means simply remain calm when you're faced with that difficult situation. That's patience. Then you can see the situation more clearly, and then you can look at how best to respond. So with a patient mind, we can respond rather than react with anger. So that's what patience means.
Now, you were mentioning that if you follow those things, you'll get to enlightenment. How many, no, you're not going to say how many people, but I mean, what's the percentage of people who go through this actually become enlightened? Is this something that's typical or rare? If you're going to find a teacher, are all those teachers enlightened, that's why you're going to them? Like, I'm just trying to understand that.
Sure. Of course, as I mentioned already, I think once or twice, is as we progress in the spiritual path, one of the qualities that we really develop a lot is humility, which means if someone's engaging in spiritual practice and in public they're boasting about how far they're advanced, that's a pretty sure sign they're just deluded, that their ego has hijacked their spiritual practice and now they're just a big spiritual ego and not really going anywhere. If you have a qualified teacher and they're really very advanced and they believe that in private with you they tell you something like that, or they display some ability that would inspire you in a good way, they do that. But if they thought that by them telling you how advanced they are or displaying some ability, you would just then idolize them, then they would never show any of that to you. So they would only show or explain if they felt it would inspire and benefit you in a good way, and only generally in private. They would never really do it in public. So the bottom line is, we don't know.
Oh, okay.
We don't know, and if you ask someone and they are advanced, they'll probably give an answer like Dalai Lama, I'm just a simple Buddhist monk, I can't even meditate very well. I mean, that's often the answer he gives. So, of course, we can sort of infer that someone maybe is quite advanced through the way of speaking and their behaviour, but more than that, it's difficult to know. I mean, I think the reality is that the number of people who have achieved enlightenment now in this time is not a huge number. I think that's probably fairly safe to say. There are not thousands of people achieving enlightenment every week. I think maybe not. Unfortunately.
Right.
Unless she will be a Buddha, so she
Any other questions about the Lam Rim overview? Otherwise, we'll go into these two final practices. Okay, so let's look at those two practices of shamatha and vipassana. So the shamatha practice we've already started to have a look at on the first evening, and we have a chart for this that I'll refer to shortly. But just to review a few things we covered on the first evening. So remember, shamatha is a concentration practice. It's one of these stabilizing meditations to stabilize the mind. And concentration, the word concentration, is coming from the Sanskrit word samadhi. So samadhi just simply means concentration in general. And in Buddhism, there are many levels of samadhi we can develop. One of those levels, the minimum level, the first level, is called shamatha. And that's the minimum level of samadhi we are to cultivate in the spiritual path. Often in the Theravada traditions, when they talk about concentration or samadhi practice, often you won't hear the word shamatha. More often in the Theravada traditions, you'll hear the word dhyana. And there are 4 levels of these dhyanas, and these are higher levels of concentration than shamatha. And there are even 4 levels higher than that. But generally, in the Theravada traditions, when they talk about the samadhi or concentration practice, you most likely hear that you are to develop these 4 dhyanas. Whereas in the Mahayana traditions, when you talk about concentration or samadhi practice, more commonly you'll hear the word shamatha. And again, shamatha we can divide into 2. Shama means calm, ta means to remain or abide. So this is often translated into English as calm abiding. So in this practice, we are cultivating 2 qualities, as we saw on the first evening. We're cultivating stability, so a stable mind, a mind that can focus without becoming distracted. But not only do we want a stable mind, we want to be able to focus very clearly on the object. So clarity is second quality. So stability and clarity to overcome dullness and distraction. But on that first evening, we added a 3rd quality, one that's normally not mentioned in the meditation texts, and that is the quality of relaxation. And I think it's important to add that for us in our modern society, because unfortunately we come into meditation practice from very hectic lives, fast-paced lives, a lot of bombarded by stimulus, a lot of agitation, a lot of stress, and our minds tend to be very chaotic. So that whenever we focus on anything, our natural tendency is when we focus is to tighten, to tense. And as I mentioned the other night, if we do that for a short time, that can sort of work. But if we focus with a tension for longer periods, we become completely exhausted and often become very agitated. So this is not the approach we want to follow here in meditation. So the very first thing we need to learn to do in this practice is we need to relax. Relax the body, relax the mind. So if we can relax the body and mind, then we can work on stabilizing the attention. And with a more stable mind, we can work on improving the clarity of our attention. So those were the qualities we're trying to cultivate in this practice of shamatha. And then we saw what objects should we use. And again, the general recommendation here is use the object that works best for you. For many of us, that will be the breath. And it's probably the most widely emphasized and recommended object in Buddhist traditions. To focus on the physical sensations of the breath. And for us, of course, and the texts often say that if you're the sort of person who is highly discursive, always thinking, then definitely the best object for you is the breath. So that accounts, I think, for most of us. We're all thinking. So much so that we're living in our conceptual mind. We've often lost touch with the physical reality, particularly our own body. So by focusing on the physical sensations of the breath, of course, we get out of our conceptual mind into the body. And most of our conceptual thinking is about the past and the future. Very rarely are we in the present moment. And living in the past and the future is a source of a lot of unhappiness. So by focusing on the physical sensations of the breath, they only happen in the present moment. So they get us out of the past and the future into the present moment. So for that reason, I think the breath is probably going to be the best object for most of us. And the breath practice, we had those 3 variations we looked at. The full body variation, which means to simply notice sensations anywhere in the body associated with the breathing. This is very helpful for working with relaxation, particularly together with the Shavasana or corpse posture, lying down. Very good, this practice. And then looking at the abdomen, focusing on the abdomen. This is very good and emphasized in many of the Theravada traditions. Very good to stabilize the attention, for stability. And lastly, the third variation, the nostrils, because it's a much smaller object, it's very useful for improving the clarity of our attention. So that's what we've been working up until now with in this retreat. And the other 2 objects I mentioned on the first evening was the mind. And the mind, of course, many people find more challenging than focusing on the breath. But again, I think focusing on the mind in the shamatha practice can bring enormous benefits in our modern society. Because again, I think many of us in our modern society are tormented by our own minds. We are slaves of our own mind. And this practice of observing the mind, instead of being the slaves of our mind and tormented by our mind, will become the masters of our mind. Because now, of course, when some mental event comes up in our mind, some thought, emotion, memory, we tend to do one of 2 things automatically. The most common thing is that we identify with that mental event, we latch onto it, we follow it, and then we get caught up in our stories, and they often overwhelm us. And the other thing that we sometimes instinctively do when something comes up in our mind is if we don't like it, we don't know how to deal with it, we just push it back down, we suppress it. So both following and suppressing really just makes more stuff come up. And really we get overwhelmed by our mind. Whereas in this practice of observing the mind, we are getting into developing the ability to be like an impartial observer or witness. Simply observing the mind and whatever is arising and passing, rising and passing, without getting caught up in it, without needing to suppress. And the more we do that, we're not feeding these things. So the habit of all this mental stuff coming up will get weaker and weaker and weaker. Our mind will naturally become more quiet and still. And then also, because we're in the habit of being present with them, then if some strong mental event were to arise, we could simply be present with it without it overwhelming us. So really, this practice, and I really like this practice a lot, is, I think, very, very beneficial for us, for many of us who are tortured by our own minds. So even though we may find it difficult, if we're enthusiastic about wanting to do that, I think this could be a very good object to do this practice with. Now, you may find that it's very difficult to even begin to do that. What you can do as an alternative is begin with this. Use this practice for maybe some weeks or months, or even longer maybe, until your mind starts to calm down a bit. Your mind becomes more stable, more clear. And then when you've developed a bit more stability and clarity, then you can switch to doing this practice. And you may have a little bit more basis to begin the practice. And then you can just continue with this. It was a question.
I have 2 questions. The first one, when we
observe the things that will come up in mind. To not get involved with it, doesn't it require not to have attachment to it?
Attachment to...
To emotions, memories, feelings, people.
Right. So the thing here is, and we'll just use a simple example. Let's say a thought comes up. And that thought happens to be about a person. Normally, of course, what we do when a thought about a person comes up, what are we actually engaging in? The person. That's our object of focus, isn't it?
Yeah.
In this practice, if a thought about a person comes up, what is our focus?
The thought.
The thought. So that's the difference between this practice and mindfully thinking about something. If we mindfully think about that, we're focusing on the person. If we're mindfully thinking about the person. In this practice, we are focusing on the thought itself, which just happens to be about a person. But our object of focus is the thought, not the person. So that is, so if we can focus on this, then there's nothing to pull us. Because we're observing a thought, we're not focusing on this person who normally maybe gives us a reaction of attachment or aversion because it's a pleasant person or an unpleasant person. But if we can just focus on the fact that a thought has arisen, then we can avoid that. And so this is, the practice is to focus on this, not to get, because this is actually cognitive fusion. Is a thought comes up and we fuse the thought to what the thought is about, and we end up getting caught up in this.
Just about, I understand the breath as an object because
Sure.
I know what it is and
Sure.
I
Sure.
understand the sensation. I don't get the mind.
Again, this is one of the reasons this is more challenging for many people, because this is something tangible that we can sense. It's a sense object.
Yeah.
This is not a sense object, it's mental object. So this has no physical properties whatsoever. So therefore, people find it more challenging. So when we're observing the mind, again, the mind is not really a thing. A mind is the name we give to that space and all the things that appear in that space. You know, thoughts, emotions, memories. And that's just a flow of, and that's what we're observing. That's what is the mind.
But we need to concentrate on it, no?
Yeah, so we're observing that space and whatever arises in that space. A thought, emotion, memory, observing them arise. If there's nothing arising, we just sit and observe that space, the space of the mind, the space where all mental things appear. Of course, it's not physical space. We can't see it with our eyes, but we can see it with the mind.
I also have two questions. The first one is you choose the object that is best for you.
Correct.
So if you're practicing on, like, focusing on the nostrils,
Right.
it doesn't mean you don't, through that practice, you don't create more stability and more relaxation through, like, because you're not supposed to switch the object of the breath, right? The focus on.
Right. So we're not suggesting that we only can develop clarity with that. What I'm saying is that is particularly useful for clarity. Of course, with this, we have a relaxed and stable mind as well. Is that the question?
Yeah, so
Yeah.
if you practice
Yeah.
on any other object of the breath, you
Yeah, so you wouldn't want to be, if you're doing this sort of like a daily practice, you wouldn't want one day to focus on the abdomen, the next day at the nostrils, the third day full body. That would be counterproductive. So pick one of these that you resonate with. Maybe for example, we're the sort of person that's completely wired all the time. Then I think if that's the case, maybe not good to start here. Rather pick that or that, maybe this one even, and just work on relaxing because we're completely tense all the time. So then we just pick this and emphasize relaxation. Of course, we're still trying to be stable and clear as possible, but our main emphasis is relaxation. And then we just work with that for maybe weeks or months until we can really start to relax.
So when you're starting to relax, would you switch it, or would you?
Yeah, eventually, because full body it'll be hard, particularly in full body, to develop a lot of clarity because it's really quite diffuse. But it may be for really people who are very agitated and tense, it may be useful to work with this for quite some time, maybe months or even years, to really. So. You know, but then yes, I mean at some point then from here it would be good to work here or here, or maybe even go to something else eventually.
Okay, and the second question is if you're focusing on the mind,
yeah,
and there's I think there are like, I'm lacking the words, if you have like a simple thought, just an image or
sure.
just a regular thought,
Sure.
something that is easier to observe.
Right.
But if there's something that is like really heavy,
Correct. Yeah.
what do you do with it?
Well,
do you rather to put it aside for now? Do you do with it?
No. I mean, of course, if we're using this as the practice, some things are easier to observe, like particularly things that are not emotionally charged. Things that have some emotional charge to them, it's harder to just observe them. We get caught up more easily. So some very simple thoughts and so forth and mental images tend to be a lot easier just to observe them arise and pass. Emotions and things, much more sticky, more difficult. We tend to gel with those very quickly. So there are some mental events that are easier to observe, some more difficult. But with all of them, we try to observe. And if we notice that we get caught up in some mental event, then of course let go of grasping onto it and just come back to observing the mind. So just the normal thing. That's all.
My experience is that when I become aware of a thought, immediately it disappears. So is this suppressing?
No, no.
I
Generally
don't have this
not.
experience of letting it come and go. It doesn't go. It cuts off.
See, unless the mental event has a lot of energy to it, if it's just your average run-of-the-mill thought, then it doesn't have much energy. And so as soon as you see it, it means you're not caught up in it, which means there's nothing feeding it. So it's got nowhere to go. So most of these will just go straight away, gone, because we're not feeding them. So that's okay.
How do I distinguish between this and suppressing?
When we get into this practice, we can notice that. It becomes more and more obvious. Maybe as a beginner it's not that obvious.
The emotional effects.
But it's when we have a preference. If we have a preference for it not to be there, then probably there's some suppression going on. So in this practice, we're not having a preference for one type of thought over another. And we're not even having a preference for a still mind than one that has thoughts. So if you notice some preference for something to be there or not be there, then we're getting caught up.
If I have a problem or a question, do you find it useful to meditate on it?
What you mean, problem or question in?
You like.
Yeah. And I think I think Albert Einstein had something to say about this. He said, you can't solve a problem at the same level that it was created. Meaning that often our problems are coming from our conceptual mind, and we're trying to solve it with the same mind that created the problem. And so we go round and round and round and round, and we never seem to get a solution. So what can be very helpful, and that's related to the shamatha practice, is to simply put the question there that you want a solution to this problem. So you have set the intention, I want to solve it, and then drop it. Let it go. Forget about it.
So the Zen asks the question, what is this? What is this? You know?
Yeah, but those questions in Zen are deliberately, what's the word? Yeah, koans. They're deliberately not ambiguous. Unsolvable. Huh? What's the word I'm looking for? Anyway, but basically those questions in Zen are more about kicking us out of the conceptual mind altogether. So it is a little bit related, but what I'm suggesting here is that what can be helpful is to pose the question, I want to know the answer, or I want to solve this, and then completely drop it. And then, particularly if we go into shamatha practice, and we work on making the mind very still and quiet, very often the answer just pops up. In the middle of the meditation or in the middle of the night. Boom, there's the answer. Because you're allowing a space for a more subtle level of mind that already knows the answer to come through. So that's one thing we can do. Of course, if we have some problem or difficulty or something in our life, then we can use other meditation techniques to look at that in different perspectives, you know, to use the compassion angle, the wisdom angle, to investigate that problem in our life. So that's also possible. But often we just keep if we keep thinking about we can't resolve it, then one of the best things to do is just drop it and give yourself some space here. You'll be amazed, and this has been my experience a lot, is that if you go into the shamatha practice, particularly if you do more in a retreat setting where you maybe do a number of sessions a day for some days, and then the mind really starts to quieten down, you'll be amazed at how much great ideas just come popping up everywhere. Solutions to problems, great ideas. I mean, it really, sometimes there's a floodgate of them coming up. But actually, what to do with that at that time is described here. If we look on your chart, in the middle on the left side, there's a monkey in a tree, and underneath it, it's number 19. And if we look over the back and see what number 19 says, it says, since virtuous thoughts are an interruption at the time of shamatha meditation, it is necessary to stop them. At other times, it is not necessary. What that means is, if you're doing shamatha practice and you're observing the breath or the mind or whatever, and then you have some great idea pop up, and they will, then entertaining that idea at that time is not the right time. So we need to let it go and go back to the practice. If you're worried about forgetting the idea, have a little notepad next to you and just jot down 1 or 2 key words, and then attend to that after the meditation. Because otherwise you'll find the deeper you go into this practice, more and more great ideas will keep popping up. And then you just get distracted by them.
Usually for I'm noticing the abdomen, and then like almost every sitting, and then I want quiet, this awareness, so I go into the mind. But I think maybe I have an attachment because it's a very, very nice feeling, this quietness and
Quiet
awareness.
stillness, yeah.
But I don't know if it's an attachment or if
this is the, if it's, I don't know what it is, but it's very, very nice there and quiet, and my whole body is vivid, and
Yeah. In the shamatha practice, there are 3 qualities of mind that become more and more evident as we progress. That as you progress in the shamatha practice, you'll start to notice there'll be periods where your mind seems to be crystal clear. There'll be periods where you'll notice your mind becomes completely still. And there'll be periods where you notice your mind becomes very blissful. All of those experiences are very nice experiences. So in the shamatha meditation manuals, the manuals warn the meditator about these, because they're seductive. And the meditation manuals say, please do not get caught up in these experiences with craving and attachment. If you do, your whole practice will come to a grinding halt, and you're just going to get frustrated. So rather, use these, because all of these provide a very good mind to do the shamatha practice. To have a clear, still, blissful mind is perfect for shamatha practice. So when they come, use them to go deeper into the practice, and use them as a signpost that you're actually going in the right direction.
So to go and do the
Well, to
shamatha practice again? Or?
Yeah, I mean whether you're, because this can arise focusing on the breath, the mind, anything.
Okay, so I'll continue focusing in the mind. Okay.
Whatever you're focusing on,
Yeah,
continue.
but these are feelings.
Because these things provide a very good situation to keep focusing on whatever you're focusing on, and understand that then this is like a signpost that we're going in the right direction. Don't get caught up in these, because it's so easy to do. Particularly when they first come, you go, oh, that's nice, I love that. Then you just come to a grinding halt, and you're just going to get frustrated.
I have a question about the rising of the thoughts or the feelings or the memories.
In this practice?
In this when we practice the meditation and things are coming up.
Yeah, but which meditation? You're talking about this one? Because it depends on what you're doing, what you do with them.
If I'm doing with the breath and stuff.
Well, if you do with the breath, anything that comes up in the mind is a distraction. You need to let it go and come back to the breath.
What do you mean let it go? Just keep thinking about the breath? And
No, just come back to the breath. Let it go basically means stop paying attention to it and just come back and focus on the breath.
Okay.
In this, you don't do that. You observe that thing.
But observing, does it mean thinking it as well?
No.
How
Because that's...
How can a thought come up without thinking it?
No. A thought is about something. What we do, like the thought about the person,
Yeah.
what we do, of course, is we fuse the thought to the person. So we get caught up in focusing on the person. So rather we should be focusing on the thought directly. Because thinking about the thought is commentary on commentary on commentary. We can think about our thoughts, but then it's another thought about another thought about another thought.
Yeah.
So we are just to simply observe the thought directly without commentary, without commenting on that thought at all.
Yeah, but maybe it's a neutral thought. Maybe
Then you focus on that neutral thought. You may have just the thought, cup,
But
and then you
how
just
can
focus
I
on that
know
thought.
What do you mean focus on that thought?
Just notice that a thought,
That I'm thinking about cup?
that a thought about cup has arisen, and watch that thought. That's it.
Okay, and if that thought is leading me to another thought, that means I'm into that already, right?
Yeah, because then the thought about the cup, see, if you're focusing on the thought, that's not going to precipitate anything else. But if you get caught up in the thought about the cup and you're focusing on the cup, that's probably going to precipitate some other thought.
Okay.
So in this practice, if you notice there's some thread to what's coming up, you're sort of caught up a little bit.
Okay.
What you'll notice in this practice, if you're not grasping, the thoughts will be very random. There won't really be any connection. If there seems to be a connection, a bit of a story unfolding, then that's a sure sign there's still some grasping going on.
Okay. And with the breath, if I'm thinking during or stuff comes up, I just need to forget them and concentrate on breathing?
Yeah. So if a thought comes up and you're focusing on the thought, then just stop focusing on it and just go back to the breath. That's it.
Okay.
In other practices that are non-Buddhist, I've had meditations using like a flame of a candle or music. Is that
Sure.
anywhere inside the Buddhist practice?
Any practice which involves focus is going to be helpful. So even here, they present a number of objects, certain traditions, and then they say, oh, you can't even focus on the breath? Okay. Pick a stick or a pebble, put it in front of you and look at it. So even that can be a starting point. But this is a very coarse object. A visual object like that won't get us very far. I mean, it could be a good starting point, but then we have to move to a more subtle object than something visual. So then they recommend, if you can't even start here, it's too difficult, pick a stick, look at it. Once you start to get a bit of stability, instead of looking at the stick, focus on the mental image of a stick. You're moving to a mental object. So yes, you could start by looking at a candle or something, but that won't get you very far. I mean, it may be good if we're completely all over the place as a starting point, but at some point we'll need to move to something a little bit more subtle than looking at a candle or looking at a stick or listening to a repetitive sound.
Is there anything with like a visual object, like an altar or a statue of
Yeah,
Buddha?
yeah. In fact, in the Lam Rim, when we come to the shamatha practice, anyone who's studied shamatha in Lam Rim, the one that's recommended often most is a mental image of a Buddha. And then often there they say, okay, start by having a picture and look at the picture for some time, and then let go of that and just look at the mental image of that as the next step. Yes?
What you say right now is the step before the breath. That's it.
Yeah, so what I'm saying is that in some traditions they give you a list of possibilities, and then they say sometimes, oh, you can't even do the breath? Okay, if you can't do that, start with this. Look at a stick.
And my question, because when you say full body,
Yeah.
it's in once, all the body, or you...
No, anywhere. So
the abdomen is part of the body.
Sure. So this practice is simply notice anywhere in the body any sensations associated with the breathing. So on one breath you may notice something going on here. In the next breath, something going on here. In the next breath, something here, then here. So you can just move around wherever you happen to notice any sensations associated with the breathing. Easy. And it's good for relaxation.
It's easier than stay in the only
Sure.
in the abdomen.
Sure.
What about the heart breathing?
Yeah.
It's not breath, but it's still
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
physical body, and
Yeah.
it's also always there.
Yeah.
And
In
I-
Buddhism, very good point. In Buddhism, there are a couple of points that are very, what's the word, delicate. One of them is here, another one is here. Because when we go into Tantra practice, and I talked about we have to do this manipulating subtle energies, the way we generally do that is that the subtle mind and subtle energies are like this. They often have the analogy that the subtle energies are like the horse and the subtle mind is like the rider of the horse. They always go together. which means if you focus here or here, then the subtle energies go there. And this is a very powerful point. So, and particularly if we focus with tension here, we can get a lot of mental disturbance. So generally at this level of practice, it's not so much recommended to do much focus here intensely, because it's a very powerful point and we can really create a lot of unbalance in the subtle energies. Similarly here, this point also is a very powerful point. So if we're doing intensive shamatha practice as a beginner, often it's not recommended to focus here or here, because they can provoke a lot of shifting of energies and imbalance.
Not really. I mean, here is it's a...
Yeah, but we're talking about subtle body, and this is a very important point, like this, in the subtle body. So, just to be, I think as a beginner, it's probably not best to focus here, because unfortunately many of us focus with tension. If you focus here with tension for a longer period of time, you can really become unbalanced.
Actually, the reason I asked it is because when I look at the breath,
Yeah.
then I start manipulating the
Yeah.
breath.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
I find it very hard to look at the breath and be sure that this is my natural
Exactly.